Hello, dear listeners. Tonight, I'm taking you to the coldest truth of the Middle Ages. Forget the glamorous castle life Hollywood has shown you, because the reality was far more brutal. Nobles shivering between stone walls, frozen goblets of wine, and lords waking to find ice crystals on their beds in the morning. Spending winter in a medieval castle was nothing but a struggle for survival. Behind the romanticized tales of knights that historians love to tell lies, the raw story of people trying to live in a stone labyrinth at -10 degrees. Tonight you'll hear what lay beneath the fur cloaks, the bone-deep cold inside thick stone walls, and the daily fight for a single cup of hot soup. Welcome to Sleep and History. If you enjoy this kind of true history content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and how many degrees it is outside right now. Maybe you're somewhere warm tonight, listening to this story in far more comfort than any medieval lord ever knew. Now dim the lights. Settle in wherever you are, and let's journey together into freezing stone walls, smoldering hearths, and the noble life of the Middle Ages battling winter's deadly cold. Because what you're about to learn tonight will throw some of history's coldest, cruelest truths right in your face. The garderobe, a matter of life and death. You wake in the dark on a winter night and feel nature calling. Today, that just means a bathroom a few steps away. But if you'd lived in a stone-walled castle in the 14th century, that call could become a genuine matter of life and death. Going to the toilet in a medieval castle wasn't a routine need. It was a dangerous adventure, requiring courage and strategy. Toilet systems were one of the least discussed, but perhaps most critical aspects of castle life. Full of difficulties the modern mind can barely grasp. The castle's toilet arrangement was housed in special chambers called garderobes, French word meaning wardrobe, since people also hung their clothes there. The reason was surprisingly practical. The ammonia smell from human waste kept fleas and other pests away. So the best place to protect valuable fabric was right next to the foul-smelling privy. These small chambers usually jutted outward from the castle walls like little turrets. Inside was a wooden seat above a deep shaft that opened straight to the outside of the castle. Waste simply fell through the opening into the moat, the river, or the base of the wall below. There was no filtration, no sewage network, no sanitation measures whatsoever. Everything went straight into the environment. In winter, this system turned into an absolute nightmare. First, the cold made the wooden seat feel like ice. Sitting bare-skinned on it risked frostbite. Some wealthy families solved this with animal hide covers, or even had small cushions specially made for the purpose. Wind was another huge problem. Cold drafts blowing through the shaft would rush upward through the opening and seem to freeze the person sitting there. Not just uncomfortable, but a real health hazard. Many castle residents developed kidney inflammation, bladder infections, and other serious urinary tract illnesses as a result. The need to use the toilet at night was like something out of a horror film. In darkness, the castle became an entirely different place. Narrow, winding corridors, extinguished torches, and echoing sounds made the trip to the garderobe a genuine test of courage, with real risk of slipping, falling, or getting lost along the way. The most dangerous moment of all was needing the toilet during a siege. Besieged castles were frequently under arrow and catapult fire, and the garderobe turrets jutting from the walls made perfect targets. Throughout history, more than a few nobles died to an enemy arrow while using the privy. Hygiene, meanwhile, was simply horrifying. There was no toilet paper, straw, leaves, scraps of cloth, or, in the most luxurious cases, wool were used instead. Water for cleaning was also scarce. Most of the time, people could only wash their hands with cold water. Soap was considered a luxury, generally reserved for special occasions. One of the most humiliating situations castle residents faced was needing the toilet while hosting guests. Social etiquette made leaving the table during a feast a grave breach of manners. So many people were forced to hold it for hours, leading to serious health problems. For women, things were even harder. Moving inside a cramped garderobe chamber while wearing heavy, layered dresses was extremely difficult, and access for pregnant women was nearly impossible. Many women, therefore, preferred using a simple chamber pot in their room at night instead. Winter also brought the problem of frozen waste. Solid matter accumulated in the garderobe shafts and froze in place. When spring arrived and these frozen piles began to thaw, unbearable odors spread around the castle, bringing with it the risk of disease and epidemic. Another danger of the garderobe system was structural failure. These small chambers jutting from the castle wall could sometimes collapse, especially in older castles, where the stonework had deteriorated over time, and the little turrets carried a real risk of caving in. Anyone using the privy at the moment of a collapse had very poor odds of survival. For children, it was worse still. Young castle residents struggled to use facilities designed for adults. And because the risk of falling was so high, children generally had to be supervised whenever they used the garderobe. One of the most terrifying stories of all involved sabotage. Enemy soldiers sometimes tried to infiltrate a castle through the garderobe shafts themselves. Assassins climbing up through these narrow, filthy passages could kill nobles caught off guard. Using the toilet in a medieval castle was full of difficulties unimaginable by modern standards. Cold, darkness, filth, disease, the risk of falling, and even the risk of death. It's impossible not to feel respect for the people who faced their most basic needs under such conditions. Imagining castle life in the Middle Ages is enough to make you appreciate just what a blessing modern plumbing really is. The dawn ritual. Waking the castle, the quiet moment when the first light strikes. The castle walls actually marked the beginning of an intensely busy period. Long before sunrise, before even the faintest hint of dawn light, a hidden waking ceremony began for everyone living in the castle. This ritual was such a complex, delicate system that a single mistake could throw the entire household into disarray. The morning waking ceremony, one of the most mysterious and least known aspects of castle life, was built on strict hierarchy and timing. Different classes had different waking hours, different waking methods, and different morning routines. The reasoning behind this wasn't just order. It was also about security, prestige, and social control. At the top, the waking of the Lord and his family was practically an art form. The Lord's personal valet had learned to enter the room silently, without disturbing his master's sleep. His first task was to revive the fireplace and bring the room's temperature up to the right. level, done so quietly that the Lord often wouldn't wake at all during the process. Once the room had warmed, the valet would approach the bed and begin a specific waking ritual, carried out gently and respectfully so as not to sour the Lord's mood. First, a soft cough to announce his presence, then a set phrase such as, "My Lord, the new day is beginning." The Lord's waking followed its own protocol, too. He didn't simply climb out of bed. First he recited his morning prayer, then discussed the day's plans with his valet. Meanwhile, chamber servants quietly prepared his clothing and sent word to the kitchen for breakfast service. The lady's waking ceremony was even more elaborate. Her personal maid was responsible for coordinating her beauty routine and dress preparations. Waking the lady meant not just getting her out of bed, but preparing her entire appearance for the day: hairstyling, skincare, and choosing an outfit were a long process that began in the early morning hours. Children had their own waking routines depending on age. Young princes and princesses were woken by their nurses with special songs and stories, not merely an act of affection, but also a psychological method meant to put children in a good mood at the start of the day. For knights and nobles, the waking ritual had a more military character. These warriors rose before dawn and spent the first hours of the day training and preparing. Armor checks, weapon maintenance, and readying their horses were an inseparable part of the morning routine. For the servant class, the system worked entirely differently. The lowest-ranking servants rose in the final hours of night, working to have the whole castle ready before dawn broke. Kitchen staff lit the fires, cleaners swept the corridors, and stable hands fed the animals. One of the most mysterious aspects of the door knocking ritual was the strict rule system around who could knock on which door. Servants could not knock directly on the Lord's door. That duty belonged only to senior attendants. Likewise, lower-ranking staff were not permitted anywhere near the ladies' room. Every door had its own knocking pattern and code. 3 light knocks meant an emergency. 2 long knocks meant routine service, and a single strong knock signaled the arrival of an important guest. This code system was so well developed that experienced castle residents could tell who was arriving and for what purpose just from the sound of the knock. The hardest part of the morning waking ceremony was the requirement for silence. While most castle residents were still asleep, servants had to complete all their preparations quietly. Footsteps, conversation, doors opening and closing, the sound of carrying objects. Everything had to be kept under control. In winter, these rituals became even harder. Cold air made sounds echo more sharply, and the longer darkness meant more candles and torches were needed, raising the risk of fire. Servants had to avoid slipping on frozen staircases, while making sure not to fall behind on their duties. Religious rituals were also an important part of the morning waking ceremony. Morning prayer in the castle chapel was a sacred moment that united everyone around a common purpose. The bell's toll reached every corner of the castle and announced the official start of the day. Preparing the dining hall was one of the most critical parts of the morning ritual. The table setting, the temperature of the food, and the timing of service all had to be perfect. By the moment the Lord and his family sat down for breakfast, every preparation had to be complete. Security checks were another essential piece of the morning routine. The handover from night watch to day guard was vital to the castle's continuous security. Gate checks, wall inspections, and armory checks were repeated every morning. One of the more curious rituals was weather prediction. Experienced castle residents would observe the sky, wind direction, and animal behavior to forecast the day's weather. Important information for planning the day's work. The morning waking ceremony also had a strong social dimension. During these rituals, castle residents exchanged the day's gossip, spread news, and strengthened their social networks. The women servants gathered in the kitchen, while the men gathered in the stables, not seen through modern eyes. The dawn rituals of medieval castles formed an intricate, highly detailed system. Living through these morning ceremonies, where every movement was calculated, every sound controlled, and every action bound to protocol, demanded discipline and coordination. The castle table, hunger stronger than luxury, as you approach the grand table standing in the middle of the great hall. The smell that hits your nose isn't the delicious aroma you were expecting. Instead, a nauseating wave of soured wine, moldy bread, and meat of uncertain origin greets you. Welcome to the medieval castle table, a world where hunger was more powerful than luxury, and survival came before the pleasure of taste. The drama that unfolded in castle kitchens during winter had nothing to do with the lavish feasts shown in Hollywood films. The truth is that in the depths of a freezing winter that dragged on for months, finding fresh food was nearly impossible. Castle residents survived on preserves made the previous summer, salted meats, and whatever dubious quality provisions luck happened to leave them. The story of the wine was especially sad. Large wine barrels were stored in the castle cellars and would genuinely freeze on cold days. As frozen wine thawed, the fermentation process broke down. The wine turned sour and became undrinkable. Yet since there was no alternative, this soured, sometimes vinegary liquid still ended up on the table. Even wealthy nobles resorted to warming their frozen wine and adding spices just to make it palatable. Meat was even more horrifying. Salted and dried in an attempt at preservation, by the end of winter, it was often unrecognizable. Too much salt turned it hard as mummified leather. Too little led to rot. Cooks often had to taste meat just to determine whether it had spoiled. Discolored, foul-smelling, oddly textured meat was disguised as best as possible under heavy spices and sauces. Bread was perhaps the most tragic of all. Damp and cold caused it to mold very quickly. The moldy parts were scraped off and the remainder rebaked. Sometimes the mold had spread so far that more than half the loaf had to be thrown away. In these cases, castle residents had to eat bread made from strange mixtures of cornmeal, bitter herbs, and even sawdust. Dairy products were a total gamble. Cheese that was too hard had to be sawed through. Cheese that was too soft spoiled and gave off a foul smell. Butter often turned bitter, and milk soured. Cooks tried various tricks to salvage these products, but the result was usually disappointing. Vegetables were no better. Finding fresh produce in the dead of winter was impossible. Onions, carrots, cabbage, and other vegetables stored in the castle cellars had their spoiled parts cut away, and whatever remained was used in cooking. Sometimes, what was left after trimming, the rot was so small, it could only be used to add a hint of flavor. Fish was particularly absurd. Salted fish grew hard as stone by the end of winter and gave off a horrific stench. Making it edible again meant soaking it in water for days, beating it, and adding heavy spices. The result often resembled a pile of seasoning more than actual fish. The most fascinating rescue operations happened in the Sissa kitchen, where cooks showed astonishing creativity trying to make spoiled food edible. Rotten meat was boiled at length, then fried, then buried under piles of spices and sauces. The goal wasn't flavor. It was simply satisfying hunger. Large feasts turned tragically comic. A host obliged to serve guests only the finest food expected miracles from his cooks, who sweated trying to work culinary wonders with rotten ingredients. The dishes that reached the table often looked impressive, but tasted terrible. Children suffered most of all. Their small stomachs couldn't handle such heavy, spoiled food, and they fell ill constantly. Mothers tried to prepare softer food, but options were extremely limited. Children often survived on little more than bread, soaked in water or watered-down soup. Servants had it worse still. The leftovers and worst portions of the nobles' meals fell to them. Even the kitchen scraps were considered valuable, picked over for anything edible. Bone broth, breadcrumbs, and vegetable peels formed the basis of the servants' meals. Strange food combinations were common. Sweet mixed with salty, meat combined with fruit, odd sauces attempted. These mixtures often turned the stomach, but hunger made almost anything edible. One of the most horrifying moments was finding live insects or worms in the middle of a meal. Stored grain and flour became infested, and worms in bread or insects in grain dishes became routine. People grew so accustomed to it that they simply picked the bugs out and kept eating. By late winter, as castle stores emptied out, things grew even more dire. Hay and grain normally reserved for animal feed were given to people instead, and in the worst moments, some even boiled and ate scraps of leather. Getting through winter at a medieval castle table was full of difficulties unimaginable by today's standards. Just imagining the suffering of people forced to eat rotten food, fight hunger, and try anything to survive is enough to turn your stomach. Winter, childbirth. A line between life and death. You are 9 months pregnant, and your labor pains begin on the harshest day of winter. The thick stone walls around you may look protective, but this moment is actually the most dangerous of your life. As a noblewoman in the Middle Ages, giving birth meant dancing on her razors. Edge between life and death, and winter multiplied. That risk many times over. Childbirth was one of the greatest mortal threats women faced. In the Middle Ages, the statistics reveal a horrifying truth. Roughly 1 in 5 women died during or after childbirth. For noble women, the odds were slightly better, but the extra dangers of giving birth in winter erased whatever advantage their social status offered. Winter's greatest enemy was the cold, and stone walls only fed it. Castle rooms stayed frigid despite the fireplace. Braziers and torches used to warm a birthing room created oxygen deficiency and made breathing difficult through the smoke. Cold air negatively affected blood circulation during labor and weakened the body's natural defenses. Infection risk peaked in winter. Clean water became harder to find, and what water was available often froze. Midwives trying to secure warm water for washing their hands often had to make do with ice-cold water instead. Hygiene, already primitive by the era's standards, became nearly impossible in winter. Birthing position was another problem. Noblewomen generally gave birth standing or kneeling, since lying down was considered a sign of weakness. Cold stone floors under bare feet risked frostbite and caused muscle cramping, which lengthened labor and increased the risk of complications. Nutritional deficiencies became more pronounced in winter. Fresh fruit and vegetables were unavailable, and vitamin deficiency became widespread. When a pregnant woman's nutritional needs went unmet, both her health and the babies were placed in serious danger. Iron deficiency caused anemia, and calcium deficiency led to bone problems. Medical knowledge was extremely primitive. Midwives relied on oral tradition and often on superstition. When complications arose during labor, intervention options were severely limited. A cesarean section was performed only to save the baby after the mother had died. For the mother, it was effectively a death sentence. Reaching a physician in winter was nearly impossible. Snow and storms closed the roads, making it very difficult to call a doctor. Inside the castle, the only medical support available was the experience and luck of the midwives. In the face of complications, women were often left utterly helpless. Herbal painkillers were unavailable or ineffective in winter. Poppy, lemon balm, chamomile, and other pain-relieving plants lost their potency once they weren't fresh. Women had to face agonizing pain with raw courage, often losing consciousness from the intensity of it. Controlling bleeding during birth was another major problem. Clean cloth was hard to find, and what existed grew damp and moldy in the cold. Traditional bleeding control methods became ineffective in winter conditions, leaving women at risk of dying from blood loss. Newborn care was equally dramatic. Newborns were extremely vulnerable to hypothermia, and the cold of castle rooms made it nearly impossible to keep a baby's body temperature stable. Infant mortality rates doubled or tripled in winter. Breastfeeding problems were also common. Cold and poor nutrition negatively affected a mother's milk supply, leaving babies hungry. With alternative feeding options extremely limited, the infants of mothers who couldn't produce milk generally didn't survive. Postpartum infection risk also peaked in winter. Infections during the lying-in period were far more common in cold, damp conditions, and the lack of clean, bandaging materials delayed wound healing and raised the risk of sepsis. Emotional support mattered too. The gloom and confinement of winter increased postpartum depression, and with social support networks shrinking under winter conditions, women often faced loneliness and despair alone. Multiple births were even more dangerous for a pregnant woman carrying twins or more. A winter delivery was almost a certain death sentence, with survival odds for both mother and children dropping to a minimum. The risk of premature birth also rose in winter. Cold weather and stress could trigger early labor, delivering underdeveloped babies who often died soon after. Family support during labor was limited as well. Male family members were forbidden from entering the birthing room, so women could only rely on the support of other women, and due to winter travel difficulties, even female relatives might be unable to reach them, leaving expectant mothers alone. Perhaps the most painful truth of all is how quickly the memory of women who died in childbirth faded. Given the high mortality rate, society had normalized these losses accepting women's deaths as simply part of fate. Winter childbirth in a medieval castle was full of hardships unimaginable in the modern era. Remembering the pain these brave women endured and the battles they fought helps us understand just how valuable today's medical resources really are. Sickbed and superstition. Medieval remedies. Fever rises through your body. Your cough worsens and an unbearable headache sets in. In the modern world, seeing a doctor and getting a prescription is a phone call away. But once you remember you're in a medieval castle, despair sets in. The nearest physician is days away. Winter has closed the roads, and you find yourself face to face with death. This is exactly the moment when the strange, sometimes effective, often dangerous treatments castle residents developed over centuries came into play. When illness struck suddenly in castle life, the first response nearly always came from the same source: the elderly women of the household. These experienced matriarchs, carrying folk medicine knowledge passed down through generations, were the castle's first hope, fighting illness with herbal mixtures, homemade remedies, and strange rituals. Fever-reducing methods were especially inventive. Cold compresses were applied to the patient's body. They were bathed in icy water, and when snow was available, it was even rubbed directly on the skin. These methods sometimes worked, but just as often pushed the patient into hypothermia. Alternatively, vinegar-soaked cloths were placed on the forehead, and slices of onion were tied to the feet. Treating a cough was pure trial and error. Mixtures of honey, garlic, and onion, a foul-tasting concoction, were forced on the patient. Onion honey syrup, mint tea, linden tea, and even boiled worm mixtures were used as cough remedies. One especially odd method involved rubbing warm animal fat on the patient's chest and covering it with a wool wrap. Wound treatment was stranger still. Open wounds were coated in honey and bandaged with clean cloth. Honey actually does have antibacterial properties, so this method sometimes worked. A more brutal alternative was pouring fresh animal urine on the wound. Based on the belief that urine had a sterilizing effect, remedies for stomach pain varied widely. Hot stones placed on the abdomen, cherry pit pillows, and sometimes turning the patient over for abdominal massage. Chamomile tea, fennel water, and sage infusions were staple remedies. For severe stomach pain, a small amount of alcohol was given to numb the ache. For headaches, the most common treatment was massaging the temples. Tying a tight cloth around the head, applying cold compresses to the forehead, and light tapping on the skull were often the first methods tried. A more extreme option was bloodletting from the head, usually performed by a barber, and often making the patient's condition worse. Treating broken bones was like something out of a horror film. While trying to set the bone back in place, the patient was given a wooden stick to bite down on to stifle their screams. Wooden splints were tied around the bone, and the limb was bound to prevent movement. Strong alcohol served as a painkiller, given until the patient passed out. For colds and flu, garlic reigned supreme, swallowed raw, inserted into the nostrils, or inhaled as vapor. Hot wine, spiced soups, and sweat-inducing herbal mixtures were also used. Patients were wrapped in thick blankets and kept there until they sweated it out. Skin ailments had their own strange remedies. Vinegar rubbed on itchy skin followed by salt. Moldy bread applied to skin wounds in hopes of an antibiotic effect. For psoriasis, mixtures of animal urine and sweat. For eye ailments, the most common treatment was dripping saliva directly into the eye, particularly saliva on an empty stomach, believed to fight infection. Honey water, rubbing a silver coin against the eye, and even dripping raw egg white were also used for eye inflammation. For nausea and vomiting, mint tea was given and a hot compress applied to the stomach. In cases of severe vomiting, the patient's feet were raised and the head kept lowered, a position believed to settle the stomach. Remedies for insomnia were relatively gentle. Calming teas made from lavender, chamomile, and lemon balm were given, and these herbs were burned near the patient. Sometimes a small amount of alcohol was offered to help the patient relax. In the most hopeless cases, religious ritual took over. Prayers were said over the patient. Holy relics were placed near them, and a priest was called to perform last rites. These rituals provided psychological comfort more than medical treatment. Bloodletting was attempted for nearly every ailment. Blood was drawn from the arm, neck, or groin, based on the belief that it would purge the body of bad blood. This often weakened the patient further and delayed recovery. Herbal remedies were the most common and relatively safest treatment. Medicinal herbs grown in castle gardens were dried and stored for winter use. Sage, mint, chamomile, linden, and echinacea were used against various ailments. Animal-based remedies were also common. Chicken broth was believed to give the patient strength, and bone broth was especially favored. Fish oil, royal jelly, and various animal organs were also used as medicine. One of the most dangerous treatments was cauterization for chronic pain. Iron rods were heated in fire and pressed against the aching area. This brutal-looking method sometimes actually did dull the pain in medieval castles without a doctor on hand. Fighting illness meant relying on primitive but resourceful methods by today's standards. Treatments that sometimes yielded near miraculous results, but far more often only added to the patient's suffering. The night watch, cold, silence and fear at 3 a.m. Walking alone through the castle, your footsteps echo down the stone corridors. The flickering candle in your hand casts dancing shadows on the walls, and you get the feeling that something unknown waits around every corner. Being a night watchman in the Middle Ages was an ongoing struggle of existence, balanced between life and death, testing the very limits of courage and endurance. The night watch, the backbone of castle security, wasn't made up of ordinary residents who slept the day away. These men formed a special class, battling the fear and uncertainty that came with darkness. Working in shifts, watchmen patrolled the castle throughout the night, investigating suspicious sounds and identifying potential threats before they could escalate. Being chosen for the watch was no easy task. Candidates had to be physically strong, mentally stable, and able to cope with fear, since the events that unfolded in a castle at night could push anyone past the limits of normal endurance. Darkness itself was the greatest enemy. Corners that torchlight and candlelight couldn't reach became entirely unknown territory, and watchmen had to stay constantly alert while moving through them. Enemy agents hiding in the shadows, thieves, or worse, assassins, could strike at any moment. The most terrifying aspect of a night shift was the silence. After the bustling activity of the day, the absolute quiet of night magnified even the smallest sounds. A scurrying mouse, wind rattling a shutter, or the creak of old timber was enough to put a watchman on high alert. Patrolling the dungeon was one of the hardest duties of all. The dark cells holding prisoners were filled with the stench of decay and the cries of despair. Watchmen patrolling this section had to both prevent escape attempts and protect their own safety. Some prisoners tried to lure guards into traps, using any trick they could to win their freedom. Climbing tower staircases was its own kind of ordeal. Narrow, steep stairs made worse by heavy armor, and weapons were physically grueling, and the risk of slipping on them was very high. A watchman who fell had very poor odds of survival. Weather was the watchman's biggest test. On snowstorm nights, patrolling the ramparts meant standing guard at real risk of frostbite. Strong wind extinguished torches, forcing watchmen into total darkness. In such conditions, protecting both themselves and the castle became almost impossible. Loneliness through the long night created enormous psychological strain. Watchmen who spent hours alone with only their own thoughts sometimes began to experience hallucinations. Over time, a combination of exhaustion and stress that made their duties even harder to perform. The most dangerous moments came when a suspicious sound had to be investigated. Hearing a strange noise meant a watchman had to go alone to check it out, with a very real chance of running into enemy soldiers, thieves, or attackers. In these moments, watchmen had to be both brave and extremely careful. The responsibility of sounding the alarm was another major source of stress. Raising a true alarm was the watchman's most critical duty. But a false alarm carried serious punishment, leaving watchmen under constant pressure to make the right call. Cold nights meant a constant battle against hypothermia. Heavy clothing restricted movement, so watchmen had to fight the cold while still keeping their agility. Handling a weapon with frozen fingers, walking icy stairs, both required great skill. One of the most horrifying experiences watchmen faced was witnessing death, residents falling ill and dying, accident victims, or suspicious deaths were all traumatic events watchmen had to deal with through the night. Night watchmen also became unintended witnesses to the castle's secret affairs, forbidden romances. Clandestine meetings, intrigues, and conspiracies rarely escaped their notice, often putting them in the difficult position of not knowing which side to take. Food was another problem. Eating a proper meal during a night shift was impossible. Watchmen had to make do with whatever small amount of food they carried, going hungry the rest of the time, a state that reduced concentration and slowed reaction time. With their sleep schedule completely disrupted, watchmen struggled to get quality rest during the day amid the castle's daytime noise and bustle. One of the greatest fears was the possibility of encountering the supernatural. Given how deeply medieval people believed in superstition, watchmen often worried they might encounter spirits, ghosts, or demonic beings at night, fears that sometimes caused more stress than the real dangers they faced. Weapon maintenance was another challenge. Damp air and cold caused weapons to rust, and a watchman discovering his weapon had failed at a critical moment faced an extremely dangerous situation. Working as a night watchman in a medieval castle was full of difficulties beyond anything modern security personnel could imagine. The courage these men showed defending the castle through the night made them true heroes. Forbiddens. Love and winter intrigue on a cold winter night. Amid the sound of wind slipping through thick stone walls, whispers can be heard, and they're not just the sound of the wind. They're whispers of forbidden love, secret rendezvous, and dangerous betrayal. In medieval castles, winter wasn't just a season for battling the cold. It was also when the passions, taboos, and dramatic love stories, born of confinement, reached their peak. The closed-off life winter forced on castle residents, intensified the emotional bonds between people, cooped up together within the same walls for months. People began to notice and feel things they might never have registered in normal times, and the love that blossomed in this atmosphere tended to be both more intense and more dangerous. Forbidden. Relationships among the nobility carried the greatest risk. If a married lord's secret affair with a young lady was discovered, it wasn't merely a moral scandal. It could spiral into a full political crisis. Among noble families bound by political marriages, such affairs could shatter alliances and even trigger wars. The emotional conflicts faced by noble women were especially painful. Married off for political reasons to men they didn't love, these women sometimes sought real love elsewhere, with young knights, handsome musicians, or even men of lower rank. What began as a purely emotional attachment could turn physical, and scandal would follow. Romantic relationships among servants seemed freer, but carried their own risks. Relationships between servants of different rank could disrupt the castle's hierarchy and throw the working order into chaos, especially when senior staff became involved with those beneath them, which was frowned upon. The most dangerous relationships of all were the ones that crossed class lines. If a noblewoman's secret affair with an ordinary soldier, or a lord's daughter's affair with a servant, was discovered, the consequences could be devastating. The lower-class man might be killed or exiled, and the woman could be entirely cast out by her family. Winter's long nights made arranging secret meetings both easier and harder. Darkness fell earlier, making it easier to move about unseen. But the cold made outdoor meetings nearly impossible. Lovers were forced to meet indoors to stay warm, which raised the risk of discovery. Secret letters were the most common way to express love in winter. The literate elite conveyed their feelings through correspondence, usually carried by trusted servants and kept under great secrecy. But a letter, falling into the wrong hands, could append an entire life. Affairs were uncovered in various ways, sometimes through a jealous rival's tip-off, sometimes by chance witness. The most painful discoveries came when a spouse caught the affair with their own eyes. Religious authorities took an extremely harsh stance on such matters. Church law punished adultery severely, particularly targeting women. Those considered sinful could be sent to a convent, while men might be exiled. The castle's gossip network played a huge role in spreading these stories of love and betrayal. Rumors passed among the servant women could reach the entire castle in no time, and even false stories could create real drama. Children were the most innocent victims of these situations. Those born of forbidden relationships were shunned by society and forced to carry the stigma of illegitimacy. Their futures were generally uncertain. Increased drinking during winter also fueled forbiddance. Relationships, decisions made while drunk, often led to deep regret the next morning, by which point it was already too late. Jealousy-fueled drama, including violence, became more common in winter as well. Betrayed spouses sought revenge, issued duel challenges, and sometimes deadly fights broke out. The most interesting side effect of winter confinement was unexpected closeness. People who would never normally speak began to converse through the long winter nights. And these conversations sometimes blossomed into something more. Music and poetry were the primary tools for expressing love. Secret lovers composed songs and wrote poems for each other, sometimes hiding indirect confessions in the verses that only the intended reader would understand. Breakups that happened at winter's end were especially dramatic. Once spring arrived and castle life returned to normal, the closeness built up over winter often faded. These temporary relationships sometimes turned into lasting heartbreak and long, drawn-out melodrama. The most romantic stories were the ones where true love overcame every obstacle. Couples who managed to bridge class differences, family pressure, and social barriers became legends passed down through generations. Stories of love and betrayal during medieval castle winters are striking examples of how humanity's most universal emotions take shape under extreme conditions, holding within them both the height of tragedy and the height of romance. Raising noble children. A brutal curriculum. You're 7 years old, and at 5 in the morning, you're forced to step barefoot onto icy stone. Your tears freeze on your cheeks, but crying is forbidden, because a crying child could never become a lord. The education of noble children in medieval castle life was a system so harsh, so unforgiving, and so dismissive of childhood that modern parents would be horrified. In winter, this education became even more brutal. Small bodies had to fight both the cold and unforgiving discipline at once. Noble boys' education began at age 4, and the first thing expected of a child at that age was building tolerance for physical pain. Washing in cold water in the early morning, walking barefoot on stone floors, and spending time outside without heavy clothing were part of the daily routine, the goal being to toughen the body and prepare it for future warfare. On winter mornings, 6-year-old children were forced to do gymnastics in a freezing courtyard. Running, sit-ups, and push-up style exercises were carried out in bitter cold, their breath visible as steam. Children who fainted or cried during these drills were punished and subjected to even harsher exercises. Weapons. Training began at age 3 with wooden swords. These weapons, heavy for such small hands, were made deliberately weighty to accelerate muscle development. Sword drills in the snow during winter demanded both physical and mental resilience. Children, trying to hold a weapon with frozen fingers, often cried from the pain. Discipline training was perhaps the cruelest part. Physical punishment was commonly used to teach obedience. Beatings, food deprivation, and being left alone in cold rooms were considered normal. In winter especially, being punished with time in an unheated room was pure torment for a child. Strict rules governed food, too. Noble children were sometimes given spoiled food or left hungry, deliberately, to toughen their palates. During winter food shortages, children faced the same harsh conditions as adults. Learning to endure hunger was considered essential preparation for wartime survival. Reading and writing lessons could feel like torture in their own right. Children who failed to learn Latin were beaten and forced to repeat the same passages for hours. Studying by candlelight through the long winter nights strained their eyes and caused headaches. Horseback riding lessons were particularly dangerous. 5-year-olds were placed atop massive horses and forced to struggle to stay on. Riding on icy ground in winter was a difficult skill even for experienced warriors, and children falling and getting injured was considered unremarkable. Social hierarchy was taught from a very young age. Children were taught whom to bow to, whom to speak with, and whom to avoid. Those who broke these rules were sharply corrected, sometimes made to watch a lower status person be punished as a lesson. Religious education was demanding as well. Children forced to stand motionless through long church services, knees aching, weren't allowed to move kneeling on cold winter stone. Floors for hours could be unbearable for a small body. The loneliness test was one of the cruelest practices of all. Children were left alone at night in dark rooms, expected to confront their fears alone. The long winter nights made this test even harder, forcing children to battle fear for hours. Pain-tolerance testing was carried out through deliberately. Inflicted minor injuries, needle pricks, small cuts, and burns were used to gauge a child's reaction to pain. Children who cried from the pain were considered to have failed and were tested again. During hunting lessons, children were forced to kill an animal, their first time taking a life, so that in the future they wouldn't hesitate to kill an enemy. This deeply affected many children emotionally, and some suffered lasting trauma. Girls' education was different, but equally harsh. They were expected to master household management, embroidery, and similar skills from a very young age. Girls who made mistakes faced physical punishment, and the standards of perfection demanded of them were extremely high. Marriage preparation began very early too. 10-year-old girls were taught how to obey their future husbands and how to manage a household. This training suppressed their individuality and stunted independent thought. Health education was demanding as well. Children were taught how to fight illness and treat injuries. Using real cases as practice, they were expected to grow accustomed to the sight of blood and unbothered by suffering. One of the saddest aspects was forcing siblings into rivalry with one another. To ensure strength in matters of inheritance, siblings were deliberately turned into competitors, and the bonds of affection between them were intentionally weakened. Even play was made part of the education. Children's games were structured as war simulations, turning even entertainment into a competitive exercise. Losing children were punished, and winners rewarded. The education given to noble children in medieval winter castles was a system built entirely on discipline and dominance, far removed from any modern understanding of children's rights. Though many children who went through this training suffered lasting trauma, it was believed, given the demands of the era, that such harsh preparation was necessary for survival. The tax collector's knock. A peasant's winter, there's a knock at your door. And standing on the threshold are the Lord's tax collectors. Outside, a snowstorm rages while they inspect the last sack of wheat your family had set aside for winter. As your children cry from hunger, every grain of tax you hand over will end up on the noble table at the castle. And once again, you'll be left trying to balance the scale between life and death. Being a peasant in the Middle Ages meant fighting your own battle for survival, while simultaneously financing your lord's luxurious lifestyle. The tax system was one of the greatest sources of nightmare in peasant life. In winter, lords demanded even more from peasants to cover the costs of castle living, heating materials. Food stores and castle upkeep drew heavily from what peasants produced. The most brutal tax of all was the harvest tax. Peasants were often required to give up half or more of their crop to their lord, and this rate could rise even higher in winter. Since the needs of castle residents increased, peasants had to hand over the bulk of their produce even, knowing full well that their own families would go hungry through the winter as a result. Arrival of tax collectors in a village was practically a reign of terror. These men were often armed and merciless. They beat peasants who couldn't pay, plundered their homes, and harmed women and children. Peasants tried to flee at the sight of them, but their options for escape were extremely limited. When cash couldn't be found, peasants were forced to hand over their possessions instead. Livestock, farming tools, household goods, even their clothing could be seized as payment. For peasants who lost their animals in winter, the situation was especially tragic, since those animals were both a source of milk and meat. One of the most horrifying practices was the child tax. Lords sometimes demanded children from peasant families, taking them as castle servants. Technically classified as a tax, this was, in effect, indistinguishable from slavery. Families lived with the constant risk of never seeing their children again. Tax collection grew even crueler in winter. Cold weather broke down peasants' resistance, raising the death risk for the sick and elderly. But tax collectors paid this no mind, insisting on collecting the full amount regardless. A tax on women was especially shameful. Unmarried young women were charged a bachelorette tax, while married women faced a fertility tax. When these couldn't be paid, women faced physical violence and sometimes rape. Attempting to evade taxes was an extremely risky gamble. Peasants caught trying to hide their produce faced severe punishment. Beatings, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and even execution were all possible. The most despotic lords raised tax amounts arbitrarily, citing reasons like castle construction, war preparation, or wedding celebrations, demands that could never be refused. Peasants found themselves burdened with extra costs to fund every whim of their lord. A system of borrowing developed among peasants to help cover taxes. Families unable to pay borrowed from their neighbors. But repaying these debts often proved impossible. Families trapped in a spiral of debt eventually lost their property and fell into total poverty. Harassment of peasant women by tax collectors was common. Collectors abused their power to exploit women, silencing any man who objected with threats of death. Peasant women faced both economic and sexual exploitation. Even when deaths from illness and starvation rose, tax collection didn't stop. The families of the deceased inherited their tax debts, meaning even death brought no relief. Children were left to pay off their parents' tax debts. Peasant resistance was rare and extremely dangerous. Tax revolts were crushed harshly. and rebels were executed. With limited means to organize, collective resistance was nearly impossible. One of the most insidious taxes was the road tax. Peasants had to pay simply to move around on their own land. Going to market, visiting relatives, even fetching water could all be taxed. Peasants, who couldn't pay their winter taxes, were sometimes forced to break up their families, children handed to other households, family unity destroyed. This shattered peasants psychologically and stripped away their hope God tax collectors would search peasant homes thoroughly, looking for hidden wealth. During these searches, belongings were broken, valuables stolen from women, and the family's privacy mocked without restraint. One of the most tragic circumstances arose when peasants had to sell their own children just to pay their taxes. Children sold to slave traders would never return to their families. A lifelong grief. Torturing peasants suspected of hiding money was considered normal. Water torture, beatings, and burning were used to force confessions about hidden wealth. And some died from these torments. The tax burden on peasants was so heavy that as much as 80% of what they produced was often taken as tax. What remained wasn't enough to feed a family, and peasants lived in a constant state of near-dash starvation. Yet the tax tyranny suffered by medieval peasants went far beyond anything today's sense of justice would tolerate. The suffering these people endured stands as a bitter reminder of just how valuable the concept of social justice really is. By the fireside, plots and conspiracies among the crackling sounds of the fire. Whispers can be heard. What looks like an intimate conversation between nobles gathered around the great hall's fireplace is, in truth, a deadly council where plots of bloodshed are being forged. Hidden behind faces lit by dancing flames are plans of betrayal that will decide who dies tomorrow and whose throne will change hands. The long winter nights made the perfect backdrop for these dark games. In medieval castle life, the fireplace was never just a place to keep warm. It was sacred ground for political power, where alliances were formed and broken, and where orders for execution were given. Words spoken under the hypnotic glow of firelight could shape the fate of entire kingdoms. Winter evenings were the ideal time for hatching conspiracies. Long nights, cold weather, and confined living conditions created the perfect opportunity for secret meetings. Cut off from the outside world during this period, schemers could move and plan freely, without anyone noticing. The political circles that formed around the fireplace followed a rigid hierarchy. The most powerful lord sat closest to the fire, while others positioned themselves according to their own standing. This seating arrangement itself carried political meaning, signaling who was allied with whom. The most skilled plotters were often the oldest lords, men with years of experience who had developed remarkably subtle methods for eliminating their rivals. Poison, murders disguised as accidents, secret stabbings, and even psychological pressure engineered to look like suicide. The most dangerous conversations happened across the dinner table, where flickering firelight hid facial expressions and made it hard to read a speaker's true intentions. A game of shadows that worked entirely in the schemer's favor. Providing them cover, female schemers were especially dangerous. Noblewomen, often underestimated by men, used that very underestimation to their advantage, catching their enemies off guard. A woman appearing to embroider by the fire might, in truth, be plotting a rival's downfall. Fireplace gatherings played a huge role in the art of alliance building. Two rival lords might grow closer in the warmth of the fire and agree to cooperate for mutual gain, though such alliances were usually temporary, broken the moment either side found the first opportunity to betray the other. Poison was the most common method of assassination. Wine drunk by the fire, food eaten there, or even the air breathed could be tainted with poison, often derived from natural-looking plant extracts, making detection extremely difficult. Spies were an indispensable part of fireside gatherings. Agents disguised as servants would listen in on conversations and relay important information to their masters. Sometimes, more than one spy operated within the same gathering, each unaware of the other. The most dangerous plans were the long-term ones, tracking an enemy for years, learning their habits and waiting for their weakest moment. Such long-term plots, hatched by the fireside, were carried out with patience and cold calculation. Letter schemes were another common form of intrigue. Forged letters were prepared to turn enemies against one another. These letters were often burned in the fireplace afterward, leaving no evidence behind. Religious authorities, too, were part of these political games. Priests and bishops, speaking in God's name, influenced political decisions, sometimes even issuing assassination orders under the guise of divine command. Murders carried out under religious pretense were among the most cunning of all. Oaths sworn by the fireside were sacred, but also dangerous. Whoever broke a sworn oath believed they would face punishment both in this world and the next, which meant promises were usually kept, though they could be twisted with remarkable cunning. The most terrifying scenarios were the ones involving family intrigue, a brother killing a brother, a son poisoning his father, or a wife having her husband murdered were among the most painful plots of all. Family bonds carried no weight against political interest. Even children were drawn into this world of intrigue. Young princes and princesses were sometimes used to gather information about their parents' enemies, since they seemed so innocent. No one suspected them. Hand signals made in the firelight formed a secret language. Conspirators used these gestures to communicate silently and pass along information about their plans, a language developed so thoroughly that entire conversations could be conducted through gesture alone. The fireplace itself doubled as a tool for destroying evidence. Incriminating letters, documents, and other traces were burned away, the flames erasing even the finest clues. Music and poetry were used as tools of intrigue as well. Messages hidden within song lyrics could serve as threats or warnings directed at rival lords. Traveling musicians played a large role in this covert communication. Friendships formed by the fireside were often the most dangerous of all. In the course of seemingly warm conversation, rivals could grow close, learn each other's secrets, and later weaponize that information. The most masterfully executed assassinations were the ones disguised as accidents: a fall down the stairs, a riding accident, a hunting injury, or death in a fire could all look like natural tragedy, while actually being a carefully engineered murder in medieval castles. The fireside functioned as the center of political games and deadly intrigue. The warmth of the fire heated not only bodies, but also the darkest of plans. The bedroom battlefield, getting into bed for the night, You notice your own breath turning to visible vapor, and your sheets feel like ice. Your bedroom, tucked between thick stone walls, should have been a refuge from the cold outside, but instead, it's become a trap carrying its own risk of frostbite. Surviving a night in the Middle Ages was a battle of bedroom tactics, requiring creativity and patience. Bedroom arrangement was the first line of defense against the cold. Thick fabrics, hides, and wool blankets were layered on the bed, but these materials tended to absorb moisture and grow moldy over time. Damp bedding drew heat from the body, paradoxically making people feel even colder. Beds were usually built up high off the floor. Since cold air sank downward, a raised bed frame also created room to place a heat source underneath. Some wealthy families used charcoal braziers or even hot bricks stored beneath the bed. Effective, but carrying real fire risk. The most common warming technique was the heated stone method. Stones warmed by the fireplace were wrapped in thick cloth and placed at the foot of the bed, radiating heat for hours. But stones that were too hot could cause burns, while ones that cooled too quickly weren't much use at all. Sharing a bed was one of the most practical solutions. Spouses, children, and even trusted servants shared beds to pool their body heat. A practice meant not only to keep warm, but also for safety. Sleeping alone through the long winter nights was both physically and emotionally difficult. Various techniques were developed to trap the warmth of one's own breath. Pulling the covers up over the face so breath stayed trapped underneath created a natural warming effect, though this could lead to oxygen deprivation and, in the worst cases, risk of suffocation. Clothing strategy was surprisingly complex. Wearing too many heavy layers restricted movement and caused sweating. Once the sweating stopped, the body lost heat even faster. The ideal solution was thin layering, a luxury not available to every castle resident. Exercising before bed was an effective way to raise body temperature. Simple stretches, light gymnastics, and brisk walking boosted circulation and helped one get into bed already warm. But too much exercise caused sweating, which could backfire. Hot drinks were an important part of the pre-sleep ritual. Spiced wine, warm milk, and herbal teas raised body temperature from within, typically enhanced with honey, cinnamon, cloves, and other warming spices. Bedding arrangement itself was a bit of an art form. Thin coverings went on the bottom, thick and heavy ones on top. This layering created insulating air pockets, and the edges of the covers were tucked in tightly to keep cold air from seeping in. Room ventilation required a delicate balance. A completely sealed room caused stale air and headaches. Too much ventilation let warmth escape. Small vents were left open to provide minimal airflow while conserving heat. Fighting winter depression was another factor affecting sleep quality. The long, dark nights weighed on people's mood and causes sleep disturbances. Activities like reading by candlelight, listening to music, and conversation helped keep spirits up. Special measures were taken for children, whose bodies lose heat faster than adults. Children were generally tucked in between their parents, so they could benefit as much as possible from adult body heat. Elderly residents faced an even more critical situation. Since aging slows circulation and reduces resistance to cold, special warming methods were applied for them, and they were kept under close watch. Sleep strategies changed entirely during illness. Feverish patients might need cooling, while those with chills needed extra warming. During illness, sleep itself was considered part of the treatment. Security concerns also affected sleep patterns. Making sure doors and windows were securely closed and keeping weapons within reach was part of nightly preparation against potential attack. Nightmares and night terrors were more common on cold nights. Physical discomfort could translate into mental distress, leading to fear-filled dreams. These episodes further degraded sleep quality and disrupted rest. Morning waking rituals were part of this ongoing battle with ice as well. Getting out of bed took real courage, as the body was suddenly exposed to the cold air. Dressing quickly, warming up, and getting straight into the daily routine were essential for survival. The night spent in medieval castle. Bedrooms were full of struggle, stories that make clear just how valuable modern comfort standards really are. The castle kitchen. Sorcery born of scarcity, descending into the castle kitchen. The sight that greets you is far from encouraging. Shelves with dwindling supplies, frozen water, and cold ovens await you. The responsibility of feeding everyone in the castle rests on your shoulders, but the ingredients at your disposal keep shrinking, and their quality keeps deteriorating. Working in a medieval castle kitchen was a survival art demanding sorcery, miracle working, and a constant flirtation with disaster. The castle kitchen was one of the harshest workplaces of winter. Thick stone walls trapped the cold indoors, and humidity ran high. Cooks had to work constantly in a wet, freezing environment. Frostbitten hands, the risk of illness, and continuous physical exhaustion were an inseparable part of kitchen life. Fire management was the kitchen's heart and its greatest threat at the same time. The ovens, which needed to stay lit continuously, were carefully managed to conserve firewood. If the fire went out, relighting it could take hours. Burned too hot, and precious wood was wasted. Striking this balance took years of experience. Provision management was one of the cook's greatest skills. The food stores gathered at the start of winter had to be carefully rationed through to the end of the season. How much could be used each day was calculated, and remaining amounts were constantly tracked. A miscalculation meant starvation by winter's end. Water was one of the kitchen's most critical concerns. Frozen wells, broken water systems, and contaminated water sources left cooks feeling helpless. Finding clean water sometimes took hours of effort. Hauling water was a torment in itself, since heavy containers had to be carried across frozen ground. The art of salvaging spoiled food was the true secret of the trade. Scraping mold off bread, separating the still good parts of rotting vegetables, and trying to turn soured milk into cheese was part of the daily routine. Nothing was ever thrown away, because every scrap was precious. Meat preservation techniques were fairly complex. Salting, drying, and smoking were all used to try to preserve meat. But over time, it still began to spoil. Heavy spices masked the smell of rotten meat, and it was boiled for a long time in the hope of killing off harmful bacteria. Cooks had to become creative recipe writers, constantly finding new ways to prepare dishes from the same limited ingredients. Bone broth soups, mixtures of leftover vegetables, and grain-based filler dishes formed the core of the winter menu. Kitchen hierarchy followed strict rules. The head cook made every decision, and assistants carried them out to the letter. Even small mistakes could lead to serious punishment. Cooks who wasted provisions, burned food, or violated hygiene rules could be beaten. One of the greatest nightmares was food poisoning. If castle residents fell ill from spoiled food, the responsibility fell squarely on the cooks. The cook found responsible could be severely punished, sometimes even killed. Dietary variety dropped to almost nothing in winter. With no fresh fruit or vegetables available, vitamin deficiency became widespread. Cooks tried to compensate with dried fruits, pickled vegetables, and herbal teas. Kitchen tools became nearly unusable in the cold. Metal utensils grew so cold they'd stick to bare skin, while wooden tools absorbed moisture, cracked, and broke. Constant maintenance and repair of equipment was a never-ending task. Feeding a large household required considerable organizational skill, hundreds of people eating within. The same window meant careful timing was essential to ensure everyone got fed. Nobles ate first, servants after. Disrupting this order could cause serious trouble. Food hygiene was maintained under primitive conditions. Hot water for hand washing was hard to come by, and soap was a luxury. With cleaning supplies limited, the risk of disease transmission was very high. Night shifts were especially demanding. Preparations for the next day's meals, kneading bread dough, and early morning baking all began before dawn. Working in a dark kitchen, handling sharp tools by candlelight, carried real risk. The threat of theft was constant. Servants suffering from hunger often tried to steal food from the kitchen, and cooks were responsible for guarding the provisions. If anything went missing, the cooks could be held accountable. Brewing and winemaking also fell under the kitchen's responsibility. Wine, beer, and fruit juices were prepared and quality checked. Producing a bad batch of drink meant both a health risk and a blow to the castle's prestige. Hosting guests only increased the pressure. Special dishes had to be prepared for visitors, served at a quality that upheld the castle's reputation, creating an appearance of luxury from limited resources. Required real artistry. During illness, special diets were prepared, soft foods, medicinal broths, and strength-giving drinks were made for sick castle residents, planned separately from regular meals and often requiring extra resources. Waste management was another important issue. Food scraps, bones, and garbage created both hygiene and safety concerns. Disposing of this waste safely, while keeping pests and vermin away, was a constant challenge. Working in a medieval castle kitchen demanded creativity, endurance, and continuous problem-solving. The miracles these cooks pulled off stand as proof of what could be achieved with limited resources. Dungeon, a frozen underworld. Crackling sound wakes you. It isn't coming from the straw beneath your hand. It's the sound of your own frozen tears cracking. The dark cell around you sits deep within the most brutal punishment system of the Middle Ages, the castle dungeon. Here, every breath you take is a small miracle, and every passing hour is proof of the grueling struggle between life and death. Surviving this underground hell in winter tested the very limits of human willpower. Castle dungeons were underground labyrinths designed for the worst offenders. Surrounded by thick stone walls, These cells never saw daylight, only the smell of damp, decay, and hopelessness. In winter, these subterranean chambers turned into genuine death traps. Conditions in the cells were inhumane. Narrow, low-ceilinged rooms, too small for an adult to stand upright in. The floor was caked with mud, filth, and animal waste. No hygiene rules applied here at all. In winter, this filth froze into sharp sheets of ice that the sound of dripping water was characteristic of the dungeon. Water constantly dripping from the ceiling fell onto prisoners' heads and bodies. In winter, it froze into slush, keeping prisoners perpetually wet and cold. The rhythm of the dripping slowly drove prisoners mad. The feeding system was itself a form of torture. The single daily meal usually consisted of rotten bread scraps and murky water. In winter, this food froze and became almost impossible to chew. Prisoners often had to hold frozen bread in their mouths just to thaw it enough to eat. Prisoners were given no clothing allowance whatsoever. They were thrown into their cells in whatever they'd been wearing when captured, with nothing extra provided. These clothes gradually tore, rotted, and lost whatever protective value they'd had. In winter, any exposed skin was at risk of frostbite. Disease ran rampant in the dungeons. Cold, dampness, and malnutrition made prisoners fall ill quickly. Colds, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and skin diseases were common. Sick prisoners received no treatment whatsoever and were simply left to die. Mental breakdown came faster than physical collapse. Darkness, silence, and isolation broke prisoners' minds. Hallucinations, talking to oneself, and screaming were common. The long winter nights only accelerated this psychological decline. The most horrifying punishment method was water torture. Prisoners were submerged in the dungeon's water and held near the point of drowning. In winter, this torture became even more brutal, since the water itself was ice cold. Prisoners going into shock often died of cardiac arrest. The dungeon guards were equally merciless characters, men who took no pleasure in treating prisoners humanely, and who often enjoyed inflicting suffering. Beatings, humiliation, and psychological pressure were part of the daily routine, and guards would sometimes pit prisoners against each other for entertainment. Group cells were even more dangerous. Housing multiple prisoners in the same space led to conflict and violence. Fights over food, fights over space, and the strong preying on the weak were common occurrences. And these conflicts grew even more intense in winter. Death was a daily occurrence in the dungeons. Prisoners who froze to death, died of illness, or took their own lives were considered unremarkable. Bodies were sometimes left in the cell for days, forcing other prisoners to live alongside the decomposing dead. Escape attempts were nearly impossible. Thick walls, iron bars, and constant guard checks prevented any real chance of getting out. Prisoners caught trying to escape faced even harsher punishment. Sometimes execution. Communication was completely forbidden. Prisoners were not allowed to speak to one another, tap on the walls, or make any sound at all. Those who broke this rule faced gagging punishments meant to take away their ability to speak entirely. Family visits were not permitted. Prisoners lost all connection to the outside world and received no news of their loved ones. A condition that accelerated psychological collapse and crushed any will to survive. One of the cruelest punishments involved chaining prisoners. Heavy shackles were fastened to their hands and feet, entirely restricting movement. In winter, these chains grew ice cold, causing frostbite wherever they touched skin. Deprivation of light gradually blinded prisoners. Those kept in darkness for months began to lose their eyesight, and when they finally saw sunlight again, many experienced burning pain and even temporary blindness. Human dignity was systematically stripped away. Prisoners had to ask permission even for basic bodily needs, permission that was often denied, forcing them to live surrounded by their own filth. Hope itself was deliberately destroyed. Prisoners were never told when or if they would be released, and this uncertainty broke them mentally. The variety of torture inflicted was seemingly limitless. Needles driven under fingernails, nails torn out, bones broken were all considered normal. And in winter, these tortures became even more excruciating. Spending winter in a medieval castle dungeon was one of the most horrifying experiences in the dark history of humanity. Anyone who survived such conditions can rightly be considered a survivor of a genuine miracle. Winter, training, forging nights in the cold at first light. Your heavy boots slip on the icy stones of the courtyard, and every breath beneath your armor rises as white steam into the air. The sword in your hand is freezing cold, your fingers stiff as bone, but training cannot stop, because the enemy doesn't wait for spring. War could erupt at any moment. For medieval knights, winter wasn't a season of rest. It was the most grueling training period of all. And simply surviving this brutal preparation was, in itself, a kind of victory. Night training grew even harsher in winter. Training in cold conditions simulated real combat. Since most wars were actually fought in winter, knowing enemy armies would face the same harsh conditions, knights had to be ready for it. Morning training began before daybreak. Knights rose in the dark and took their places in the frozen courtyard, and the first exercise was always a run meant to raise body temperature. Running on icy ground carried a risk of slipping, but it developed balance and agility. The process of putting on armor took longer in winter, since cold metal could stick to bare skin. Thick garments went on first, then armor pieces were fastened one by one, a process that could take up to an hour and demanded great concentration. Sword work was the hardest part of all. Staying upright on icy ground while swinging a heavy sword demanded serious skill. Gripping a sword with frozen fingers was painful, but that pain had to be endured, because real battle would demand no less. Lance training was particularly dangerous. Charging with a lance atop a horse was extremely risky on icy ground, putting both horse and rider at risk of falling. For this reason, winter lance drills were conducted with far more caution and control. Horsemanship training was one of the toughest parts of winter horses. Two were affected by the cold and became more skittish. Riding on icy ground was a serious hazard for both horse and rider, requiring special horseshoes and anti-slip measures. Shield training demanded strong arms. Carrying a heavy shield for hours was exhausting, but winter drills built up that endurance. Shield maneuvers were harder on icy ground, but that difficulty made them more effective to learn. Group combat drills were the most exciting part. Knights split into teams to stage mock battles that mimicked real war conditions and developed teamwork. These snow-covered courtyard clashes made for a spectacular sight. Target practice required precision. Archery, spear throwing, and stone throwing became harder in cold weather, as wind, snow, and ice complicated aim and calculation. Wrestling drills required knights to strip off their armor, fighting bare-bodied in the snow-covered. Courtyard built physical resilience and honed close combat. Technique, falling bare-skinned onto the snow, was itself an important test of endurance. Endurance tests were the cruelest part of all. Knights were forced to remain motionless in the snow for hours, testing their tolerance for cold. Anyone who fainted or gave up was considered a failure. Weapon maintenance was the often overlooked part of winter training. Cold and dampness caused weapons to rust, so cleaning, oiling, and protecting them after each session was essential, and this upkeep was itself considered part of the training. Tactical lessons were held. Indoors battle plans, enemy tactics, and defensive strategy were taught here. These lessons developed strategic thinking and mental sharpness. Injuries were more common. During winter training, falls on icy ground led to frequent fractures and dislocations. Learning to cope with these injuries was itself part of the training. Enduring pain and continuing to fight while wounded was expected. Nutrition was an essential part of the training regimen. Knights burned enormous calories and needed rich food, meat, bread, wine, and vitamin-rich provisions were consumed to keep up their strength. Rest and recovery were part of the program too. Excessive training risked muscle tears, so controlled rest, massage, and hot baths were used to relieve fatigue. Morale mattered enormously. The grind of winter training could easily wear down a knight's spirits, so music, song, and storytelling were used to keep morale high. Competitive drills were used to boost motivation. Knights competed against one another to see who performed better and endured longer. Winners were rewarded, and losers had to train even more. Mental preparation was just as important as physical. Battle psychology, fear management, and stress control were taught, since staying calm and avoiding panic in real combat was vital to survival. Team-building activities were also organized. Knights lived and trained together, getting to know one another closely, a bond that could save lives on the battlefield. Leadership training was given to those expected to one day command. Future commanders were taught team management, decision-making, and strategic planning by modern standards. The winter training medieval knights endured looks brutally harsh and dangerous, but given the demands of the era's warfare, it was considered essential preparation. Those who made it through emerged as genuine instruments of war. Cabin, fever, the psychology of winter isolation. The last news from the outside world arrived 3 weeks ago. Since then, all you've seen within these thick stone walls are the same faces. The only view from your window is a landscape frozen under white snow, and every passing day the world seems to shrink a little further around you. Strange sounds begin to echo in your mind. Unfamiliar thoughts surface, and the line between reality and imagination begins to blur. Spending winter in a medieval castle was exhausting not only physically, but mentally and emotionally as well. Claustrophobia-like symptoms were among the most common psychological problems of castle life. living for months within the same corridors, rooms, and views wore down people's mental balance. The walls could start to feel as though they were closing in. Social tension built up over time. Being constantly surrounded by the same people made even the smallest habits unbearable. Arguments in the dining hall, collisions in the corridor, and pointless fights became a routine part of daily life. Sameness depression was one of the most common issues. Repeating the same routine day after day, in the same surroundings, took a toll on people's brain chemistry, creating a deep sense of hopelessness. People began questioning the meaning of life, unable to imagine the future and losing all motivation. Sleep disorders affected nearly everyone. The weakened day-night cycle, lack of natural light, and constant stress disrupted sleep patterns. Insomnia led to hallucinations, irritability, and aggressive behavior. Communication problems were common too. People who talked to the same few individuals for months began to struggle understanding one another. Language began to break down. Muttering and incoherence increased, and social withdrawal became widespread. Paranoia grew as winter dragged on. People began suspecting one another, developing conspiracy theories, and struggling with trust, hoarding food, holding secret meetings, and mutual accusations became common. Memory problems were widespread as well. Vitamin deficiency, stress, and monotony weakened cognitive function, leaving people unable to recall recent events clearly. This led to confused identity and distorted perception of time. Obsessive behaviors appeared in many people. Repetitive gestures, counting habits, and meaningless routines became common. Though these behaviors developed to relieve anxiety, they created other problems in the long run. Levels of aggression rose noticeably, particularly among young men, whose tendency toward violence increased, and physical fights became more frequent. Emotional numbness was a natural consequence of prolonged stress. Past a certain point, people simply stopped feeling their emotions, leading to apathy and social disconnection. Religious fervor increased as well. Desperation drove people toward excessive piety, mass prayer ceremonies, self-punishment rituals, and even episodes of mass hysteria could occur. Children were among the most affected. Their psychological development suffered, and behavioral problems and emotional instability emerged. Alcohol use became widespread. As people drank heavily to cope with depression and anxiety, this, in turn, caused further physical and mental harm and increased aggression in the long run. Women faced additional stress due to social gender restrictions, reduced freedom of movement, and patriarchal pressure, leading to a rise in cases of depression, anxiety, and hysteria among women. Leadership breakdown had dangerous consequences. Even those in positions of authority could lose the ability to make sound decisions under the psychological strain, a risk that endangered the entire household. Cases of self-harm increased. People overcome with hopelessness resorted to cutting and burning themselves. Mass delirium, though rare, was a real phenomenon. Occasionally, a group of people would exhibit irrational behavior simultaneously, resulting in episodes of collective hysteria. Distorted perception of time was common, driven by the monotonous environment and lack of external stimulation. People struggled to accurately register the passage of time, further fueling anxiety. identity. Confusion emerged from prolonged isolation, and the narrowness of one's daily role. People began questioning who they were and what their purpose was. Even once winter ended, recovery wasn't easy. Psychological damage didn't simply heal on its own with the arrival of spring. Many people carried scars for the rest of their lives, requiring long-term support to recover. Coping strategies included music, storytelling, games, and organized social activities, not always successful, but offering at least some measure of relief, viewed through the lens of modern psychology. The psychological toll of winter isolation in medieval castles was genuinely devastating, and these experiences offer important lessons for our understanding of mental health today. Candlelit reading. Knowledge as magic has. The flickering candle flame dances across the pages of a book. Your eyes strain to make out the letters in the long winter night, one of the rare ways to pass the time. The small crowd gathered around you listens to every word you read, holding its breath, because in that era, being literate was almost as rare as sorcery. Winter nights in medieval castles were remembered as magical times where education and entertainment intertwined, where knowledge was treated as sacred, and where stories came alive. Literacy was an extremely rare skill in the Middle Ages, since the vast majority of castle residents couldn't read or write. Those who could were highly valued, usually clergy, nobles, or specially educated servants. On winter nights, small crowds would gather around whoever possessed this rare skill. Reading by candlelight demanded real skill. The flickering light created shifting shadows that made it hard to make out the letters. The reader had to hold the book at just the right distance while constantly adjusting the position of the candle. Long reading sessions caused eye strain and headaches. Books at the time were extraordinarily valuable objects, each one handwritten and bound by hand, a treasure carefully protected, sometimes worth as much as a house. As such, books were handled with great care to avoid any damage. Religious texts were the most common reading material. The Bible, prayer books, and saints' lives were the most frequently read works on winter nights, both educational and uplifting for listeners, who found comfort and spiritual strength in these stories. Historical chronicles were also beloved reading material. Tales of ancient kings, war stories, and heroic sagas captivated audiences, both informative and entertaining. Young men in particular were deeply moved by these tales of heroism. Poetry reading was a special art form in its own right. Lyric poems, love stories, and epic works were read aloud with a particular cadence. A skilled reader could move an audience to tears or bring them to laughter. These performances were essentially theatrical. Philosophy and scientific texts appealed to a more select audience. Works of Aristotle, mathematics texts, and books on natural science could only be understood by the educated few. These readings sparked intellectual debate and the exchange of ideas. Reading sessions became a social event in their own right. People of all ages gathered around the stories. The elderly shared their experiences. The young asked questions, and children let their imaginations run wild. These gatherings strengthened bonds between generations. Oral tradition remained strong. Those who couldn't read memorized the stories they heard and passed them on to others. Thanks to this oral tradition, Countless tales survived from generation to generation. Some people could memorize entire pages of text. Reading pace was very slow, far slower than modern reading speeds, allowing listeners to savor every word and fully absorb its meaning. And this slower pace helped sharpen concentration. Discussion sessions were an integral part of the reading experience. Texts that had been read aloud were discussed at length, with differing interpretations offered. These debates helped develop critical thinking and exposed people to different points of view. Writing lessons were also given on winter nights. Those who could read and write tried to teach letters to those who couldn't. Writing exercises were done with pieces of charcoal on stone. Teaching the basics of writing. Musical readings were a special kind of event. Some texts were read to music, presented as melodies, which made them both pleasant to hear and easier to memorize. Ballad-style tales were often presented this way. Children's education was an important part of these reading sessions. Moral values, codes of behavior, and life skills were taught through these stories. Storytellers were among the most beloved figures for children. Language instruction was also carried out during these sessions. Latin texts were read aloud with word meanings explained. Through this process, ordinary people began learning Latin, which in turn helped them better understand church services. Copying manuscripts was also a task for winter nights. Copies of valuable books were made by hand, helping spread knowledge, a slow, painstaking process, but essential for preserving what had been learned. A tradition of storytelling also flourished. Inspired by what they'd heard read aloud, people made up new stories of their own, exercising their imagination, a creative outlet that was both entertaining and educational. Memory exercises were a natural part of these reading gatherings. Memorizing long texts, recalling words, and retelling stories accurately all built up memory skills, abilities that proved useful in everyday life as well. Moral instruction was the core purpose of many of these stories. Distinguishing right from wrong, examples of proper conduct, and society's rules were taught through these tales, helping preserve social order and pass down shared values. The hours spent reading by candlelight in medieval castles were among humanity's most beautiful traditions, a meeting point of knowledge and entertainment, and moments worth remembering as small lights that illuminated the darkness of winter nights. Hygiene in the cold. When cleanliness becomes a fantasy, smell rising off your own body has begun to bother even you. But everything you'd need to wash is frozen solid. The water, the soap, even the space to bathe. Your hair has grown greasy, your skin grimy, your clothes stained with sweat, filth, and worse. Hygiene was already a struggle in the Middle Ages, but winter made it nearly unbearable. Cleanliness stopped being a luxury and became something close to fantasy. In winter, the basic requirements for staying clean simply disappeared. Water sources froze, soap hardened, and washing spaces became unusable, a situation that wasn't just uncomfortable, but a genuine health hazard, since accumulated filth sharply raised the risk of infection. Water scarcity was the single biggest source of hygiene problems. Wells froze, water-carrying systems broke down, and obtaining hot water became nearly impossible. What little water was available was reserved for drinking and cooking, not washing, forcing people to go weeks without bathing. Producing and obtaining soap became very difficult in winter. Handmade soap hardened in the cold and became unusable, and the animal fats used to make it froze, halting production entirely, leaving people to try to clean themselves without soap at all. Bathing spaces became unusable in winter. Outdoor bathing areas were out of the question, and indoor spaces were often bitterly cold. With no heating system, washing in these conditions risked hypothermia. Changing clothes was another major problem. With spare garments hard to come by, people often had to wear the same clothes for weeks, which became saturated with sweat, dirt, and grime. Washing clothes was nearly impossible. Hair care was one of the most neglected aspects of hygiene. Unable to find hot water for washing, people often went months without washing their hair at all, leading to dandruff, itching, and lice infestations. Alternative cleaning methods were attempted, but proved largely ineffective. Dental care was equally poor. With no toothbrush-like tools available, people tried cleaning their teeth with their fingers or scraps of cloth. Oral hygiene deteriorated, leading to widespread tooth decay and bad breath. Attempts to mask body odor mostly failed. True perfumes were far too expensive for anyone but the very wealthy. Ordinary people tried using scented herbs, but these were hard to find in winter. For women, hygiene was even more complicated. Cleaning the materials used during menstruation was very difficult. Cloths went unwashed and had to be reused repeatedly, raising the risk of infection. Children were the most vulnerable group when it came to hygiene. Since adults could barely manage their own cleanliness, children's hygiene received even less attention, putting them at greater risk of illness. The elderly faced an even worse situation. Already struggling with physical limitations, elderly people found themselves entirely helpless under winter conditions. With no one available to help, their hygiene deteriorated badly. In shared living quarters, hygiene problems only compounded. Dining halls, bedrooms, and communal areas got dirty quickly, and with no way to clean them, filth accumulated over time, making it easier for illness to spread. During sickness, hygiene became even more critical. A sick person's need for cleanliness increased just as winter. Conditions made meeting that need nearly impossible, a situation that prolonged illness and risked complications. Kitchen hygiene was another major problem. Washing dishes, cleaning counters, and keeping food preparation areas sanitary was extremely difficult, raising the risk of food poisoning and stomach illness. Animal care compounded the hygiene problem as well. Animals kept within the castle couldn't be properly cleaned, leading to bad smells and disease risk. With animal waste left unremoved in an already unsanitary environment, social life suffered directly from the lack of hygiene. People began avoiding physical closeness with one another, increasing social distance, a situation that caused both psychological and social problems. Alternative cleaning methods were attempted, but proved insufficient. Dry cleaning techniques, rubbing with snow, and herbal remedies were all tried, but none achieved real hygiene. Disease transmission was the most serious consequence of poor hygiene. Infectious illnesses spread rapidly, and outbreaks could occur, putting the health of everyone in the castle at serious risk. Morale suffered too as a result of these hygiene problems. People began to feel disgust toward themselves. lose self-esteem, and slip into depression, a decline in overall quality of life and happiness. The hygiene problems experienced during medieval castle winters are a painful reminder of just how valuable today's cleanliness standards really are, a testament to how important humanity's progress on hygiene has truly been. When tempers snap, noble quarrels and winter-loud voices from a corner of the great hall wake you, and you realize the small disagreement between two lords has escalated into shouting. What began this morning as a minor dispute has now turned into a threat of a sword duel. Cut off from the outside world and forced to live within the same walls for months, these nobles have reached the end of their patience, and even the smallest spark can now ignite an explosion. Spending winter in a medieval castle required navigating not just the cold, but the anger and violence born of confinement. The confinement of winter pushed tension among the nobility to its peak. In normal times, these people had outlets: hunting, travel, contact with the outside world for relieving stress. Through the winter, they were instead trapped together in the same spaces with the same faces. This psychological pressure could turn even the smallest disagreements into major fights. Conflicts over hierarchy were among the most common causes of quarrels. Castle society's rank system was complex, and everyone's position was a perpetual point of contention. Who sat where? Who ate before whom? Who had the right to speak on which matters? Details that constantly created friction. Inheritance disputes were another major source of conflict. As deaths increased in winter, questions of inheritance often came to the fore. Quarrels erupted among siblings, cousins, and even friends, sometimes ending in bloodshed. Marriage arrangements bred tension as well. Engagements and weddings arranged over winter became battlegrounds where different families' interests collided. Families unable to agree on a young couple's marriage could become enemies, sparking feuds that lasted for generations. Trade disputes led to quarrels too. Disagreements over land ownership, tax rates, and trade rights sparked arguments among nobles that sometimes turned violent. Money could end friendships and create lasting enmity. Military matters caused friction as well. Who held which military rank? Who would answer to whom in wartime? How military expenses would be shared? These issues were a constant source of tension, sometimes escalating all the way to a duel. Disputes over women could spark extremely serious conflicts. Rivalry between two men vying for the same. Ladies' attention sometimes led all the way to a fatal dual love triangles created. Major drama within the castle. Competition over prestige was a constant source of tension. Who dressed better? Who wore more expensive jewelry? Who lived more luxuriously were constantly compared. And this rivalry bred jealousy and hostility. Even religious matters could spark quarrels. Nobles holding different theological views could get drawn into arguments. That turned into personal attacks. Religion was such a sensitive subject that even a minor disagreement could escalate into a larger fight. Alcohol consumption intensified these quarrels. With drinking on the rise in winter, drunken fights became common. Nobles under the influence said things they'd never normally say, and behaved in ways they couldn't control. Disagreements over child rearing were common. 2. How a particular child would be educated. Who would tutor them? What position they'd eventually hold created tension between families. Arguments over children's futures could turn quite harsh. Even the seating arrangement at the dining table could spark a fight. Who sat where? Which dishes were served? Who was served first were all constant subjects of dispute. These seemingly trivial details were markers of status, which is precisely why they could trigger serious conflict. Hunting rights caused disagreement as well. Whose land could be hunted? How the spoils would be divided? Who could use which equipment led to quarrels. Since hunting was both a sport and a matter of prestige, competition ran high. Hosting guests created tension too. How visitors would be received, who would host which guest, how expenses would be split, all led to disputes. Since hospitality was a matter of prestige, conflicts often broke out over it. Quarrels among young nobles were especially violent. Youthful energy, lack of experience, and impatience intensified conflicts. Power struggles between young men could spiral out of control. Noble women were drawn into their share of quarrels, too. Rivalry among women, gossip wars, and scheming were no less dangerous than the men's fights. Women's quarrels tended to be subtler, but every bit as effective. Elderly nobles could use their experience to either stoke or diffuse conflict. Some old lords were skilled at turning younger nobles against each other for their own gain. Others sought peaceful resolutions instead. Dueling traditions determined how quarrels ultimately played out. Disputes that became a matter of honor were often settled by duel, and these could end in death. Complicated dueling rules could themselves spark new disputes. Reconciliation rituals also developed over time. Various ceremonies and rites were used to try to reconcile feuding parties, sometimes effective, occasionally forging lasting friendships out of former conflict. The quarrels among nobles during medieval castle winters were vivid examples of how human nature responds to stress. Dangerous, yes, but also an inevitable part of social life within the castle. Ice on the stairs, a deadly daily hazardure. Foot reaches for the next step and suddenly slips out from under you. The stone railing you grab for balance is frozen solid. As your body pitches uncontrollably backward, the only thought in your head is how this fall is going to end. In medieval castles, winter turned every step into a potential accident, made navigating the stairs an act of courage, and brought daily life face to face with death. Castle architecture made falling accidents almost inevitable. Narrow, steep staircases leading up to high towers, slick stone steps, and inadequate railings, already dangerous structures, turned into genuine death traps in winter. As ice transformed the stairs into what amounted to slides, ice formed in several ways. Water running off the roof froze on the steps. Condensed breath formed thin sheets of ice on surfaces. Melted snow refroze overnight into treacherous patches. This ice was often invisible, leading to sudden, dangerous surprises. The most dangerous staircases were those inside the towers. A person who fell on a narrow spiral staircase could tumble all the way to the bottom. These falls often resulted in multiple broken bones, and sometimes death. Tower stairs were especially treacherous on windy days. For elderly castle residents, the situation was even worse. Already limited in mobility, Older people found themselves essentially helpless on icy staircases. Recovery from a fall took a very long time, and complications were common. Some elderly residents became so afraid of falling that they stopped leaving their rooms altogether. For children, icy staircases were deadly traps. Small and quick, children moving fast could easily lose control the moment they hit ice. Child falls often resulted in head trauma, sometimes leaving permanent damage. For pregnant women, staircase accidents posed a double danger, risking both mother and unborn child. These accidents often ended in tragedy, and pregnant women's already compromised balance raised their risk of falling. Anyone carrying a heavy load faced extra danger on the stairs. With their field of vision restricted and their center of balance shifted, people were much more likely to fall on icy steps, and the heavy loads they carried often caused additional injury during the fall. Using the stairs at night was especially risky. Ice was nearly impossible to spot in the dark. Candlelight provided inadequate visibility, and shadows could be deceiving. The sound of someone falling down a staircase in the dead of night was enough to wake the entire castle. First aid options after a fall were extremely limited. With no modern medical intervention available, falling accidents often left lasting damage. Broken bones healed poorly, internal bleeding couldn't be detected, and there was no treatment at all for head trauma. The most common injuries were fractures, broken arms, legs, and ribs were frequent. Treated with primitive methods, these fractures often healed incorrectly, sometimes leaving a person permanently disabled. Head injuries were the most serious of all. A head striking the stone steps could cause severe trauma, unconsciousness, or even death, since brain hemorrhage couldn't be diagnosed at the time. Many head injuries proved fatal. Internal bleeding played the role of a silent killer. Invisible internal injuries couldn't be diagnosed or treated. A person who looked fine after a fall might still succumb over time to damage no one could see. Spinal injuries led to the most horrifying outcomes of all. Blows to the neck or back could cause paralysis, leaving a person disabled for life, and treatment for spinal injury was simply impossible in that era. The psychology of falling mattered too. Someone who experienced a serious fall might develop a lasting fear of stairs, unable to resume a normal life, a fear that could lead to social isolation and a diminished quality of life. Preventive measures were quite limited. Simple methods like scattering salt, sand, or straw were tried, but proved insufficient. Adding railings or repairing staircases was expensive and difficult. Servants were the group most at risk, constantly required to use the stairs. They faced significant danger multiple times a day. A servant's death from a fall was considered unremarkable, simply replaced by another. Soldiers were also at high risk. Falling in armor was difficult enough as it was. On icy stairs, it became nearly impossible to avoid, and when an armored soldier fell, the resulting injury was usually more severe. Rescue operations were dangerous too. Anyone trying to help a fallen victim risked the same danger themselves, sometimes causing a second accident. Carrying a stretcher down a staircase was nearly impossible. The statistics were grim. Staircase accidents tripled in winter, and death rates rose dramatically. At least one serious fall happened every day, with several deaths occurring each week. The social consequences were serious too. Upending family finances. Anyone left unable to work became a burden on their family, leading to real hardship. The accidents that happened on icy staircases in medieval castles remain a painful reminder of just how vital modern workplace safety standards really are. Winter provisions. The race against rot as you crack open the storeroom door. The smell that drifts out stirs mixed feelings. The promising scent of grain mingled with the worrying odor of mold. Checking the food stores you so carefully gathered for winter. You realize a little more disappears with each passing day. Some of it already beginning to rot, and spring is still months away. Surviving the winter in the Middle Ages depended entirely on the ability to keep food from spoiling, a skill that was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. Food preservation technology was the fundamental key to survival in the Middle Ages. Without modern refrigeration or canning, keeping food from rotting was a highly skilled art, and a family's ability to survive depended directly on how well they applied these preservation techniques. Salting was the most common preservation method. Protein sources like meat and fish were treated with heavy amounts of salt, which drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth, slowing spoilage. But if salting wasn't done correctly, the food could still spoil, wasting precious salt in the process. Drying was one of the oldest preservation techniques. Fruit, vegetables, meat, and fish were dried in the sun or wind to reduce moisture content, but in winter, lack of sunlight made this harder, forcing people to try drying indoors near the fire, which carried its own fire risk. Smoking was used especially for meat and fish. Food was hung for days in specially built smoking chambers, and the smoke killed bacteria while giving the food a distinctive flavor. But this method required a great deal of firewood, making it expensive. Preserving food in wine or vinegar was another common method. The acidic environment inhibited bacterial growth and kept food fresh longer. Vegetables were preserved in vinegar, meats in wine. The downside was that both wine and vinegar were themselves costly. Preserving food in fat was mostly used by wealthy families. Olive oil, butter, or animal fat sealed food off from air, preventing spoilage, an effective method. But its high cost limited how widely it could be used. Storing food underground was an ancient but effective technique. Root vegetables and grains were kept in specially prepared pits, where the earth's natural insulation buffered temperature swings and maintained steady humidity. Though rodents and other pests could damage these stores, preserving food in honey was a luxury method. Honey's natural antibacterial properties kept food from spoiling, and fruits and some meats were stored this way. But since honey was very expensive, it was reserved for only the most valuable foods. Fermentation was used both for preservation and to boost nutritional value. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut, milk into cheese, grains into fermented brews. Fermented foods not only lasted longer, but were also more nutritious. Freezing was winter's one natural advantage. Food could be kept frozen, halting the spoiling process entirely, though repeated freezing and thawing could ruin texture and alter flavor. The art of organizing a storeroom mattered a great deal. Properly arranging food, maintaining ventilation, and controlling humidity were essential for successful storage. Poor organization could ruin the entire stockpile and lead to famine. Fighting mold was a constant battle. In damp storerooms, mold spread quickly and could ruin large quantities of food. Moldy portions had to be cleaned away immediately to stop it from spreading. Pest control was equally critical. Mice, insects, and other vermin were the storeroom's greatest enemies. Cats were kept, traps were set, and storage areas were closely monitored. Portion control required long-term planning. A consumption schedule for the entire winter had to be calculated in advance, with daily portions carefully determined. A balance had to be struck between running out too early and the threat of starvation. Quality control was a daily task. Stored food was checked every day, and anything beginning to spoil was set aside. Early intervention could prevent the loss of an entire stock. Allowing partial rescue instead, alternative protein sources were explored as well. Given how hard it was to find fresh meat in winter, people tried extracting protein from dried insects, fish bone powder, and bone meal. Storing water was an art of its own. Special techniques were used to prevent drinking water from freezing, and its cleanliness was carefully protected, since contaminated water could sicken an entire family. Water quality was taken very seriously. Seed preservation was vital for the coming year. Seeds meant for planting were specially protected, kept from rotting or germinating prematurely. Losing seed stock meant the threat of famine the following year. Backup plans were also essential. Emergency reserves were kept on hand in case they emerged. Main food stores spoiled, typically consisting of the most durable and least desirable foods. Community cooperation improved everyone's chances of successful preservation. Sharing food between neighboring families, exchanging knowledge and cooperative storage practices all increased the odds of surviving the winter. The art of winter food preservation in the Middle Ages stands as one of the most striking examples of the hardships people endured. A stark reminder of just how revolutionary modern food technology really is. Sleepless nights, dreaming of warmth in your dream. You're lying on a tropical island under the sun, your whole body warm and relaxed. But suddenly you wake up, and in the real world your teeth are chattering, your toes are numb, and you're curled up shivering under the blankets. Sleep has escaped you tonight. The discomfort of the cold simply won't allow you to rest. In medieval castles, winter sleep was less about real rest and more about hours spent chasing dreams of warmth, and almost no one managed to get a good night's sleep. The body's constant battle against the cold disrupted the natural sleep cycle. The human body needs to reach a certain temperature to fall asleep properly. And when that temperature couldn't be achieved, sleep quality dropped dramatically. The icy atmosphere of castle rooms completely upended this natural rhythm, leaving people sleepless. Shivering sleep became a common problem. Muscles tensed by the cold never had the chance to relax, preventing people from reaching deep sleep. Instead, they experienced shallow, fragmented, interrupted rest. Even dream content changed dramatically. Castle residents' dreams revolved constantly around warmth, sunshine, fire, and tropical places. These dreams were so common that even dream interpreters came to consider them entirely normal. Waking frequency rose as the night went on. The cold woke people roughly every half hour, and it could take hours to fall back asleep. This constant cycle of waking and sleeping led to mental exhaustion and reduced performance the next day. Children's sleep problems were even more serious. Their small bodies lost heat faster, so children cried through the night and woke their parents, leaving the whole family sleep-deprived. With everyone's quality of life suffering, the elderly had it worst of all. Their already poor sleep patterns were completely upended by the cold. Elderly castle residents often lay awake for hours, shivering until morning. Sleeping in shared quarters was even harder. When many people shared the same room, one person's sleeplessness affected everyone else, and there was constant movement through the night. When one person woke, the others often woke too, leading to collective sleeplessness. Nightmares became more frequent as well. The physical stress caused by cold triggered fear-filled dreams. People suffered nightmares through the night, with the fear of freezing to death often reflected in their sleep and creating real psychological trauma. People constantly shifted position, trying to find some relief, but rarely finding it. This constant movement further degraded sleep quality. Difficulty waking in the morning became widespread. People who hadn't slept well through the night struggled to get out of bed and had a hard time performing their daily duties. Daytime drowsiness increased as a result. Those who couldn't sleep at night tried to nap whenever they got the chance during the day, but this only further disrupted their nighttime sleep, creating a vicious cycle that deepened the problem. Shared warming strategies were developed. Families slept together to cool their body heat, with children tucked between their parents, a method that helped somewhat, though it created its own issues around privacy. Imagining warmth became a sleep technique in its own right. People deliberately pictured warm places to help themselves fall asleep, trying to warm themselves mentally, and this technique sometimes actually worked. Alcohol use as a sleep aid increased as well. People drank before bed, hoping to create a feeling of warmth in the body and take advantage of alcohol's sedative effect. But since alcohol degrades sleep quality, it caused problems in the long run. Breathing techniques were developed too. People tried breathing warm air under the covers to heat the space beneath the blankets, using specific breathing exercises, a technique that offered temporary relief but no lasting solution. Efforts to warm up through movement were common as well. Leg exercises, hand and finger stretches, and tensing and relaxing techniques were used in bed to boost circulation and provide temporary warmth. Hot drink rituals became widespread. Hot tea, warm milk, and spiced drinks were consumed before bed to warm the body from within, offering psychological comfort as well. Storytelling became a sleep aid too. Stories about warm climates and sunny days were told to encourage a mental sense of warmth. Prayer and meditation techniques were used for sleep as well. Religious prayers and focused mental exercises helped people try to forget the cold, seeking comfort through spiritual means. Herbal sleep remedies were attempted, though not especially effective. Mixtures made from the few herbs available in winter offered temporary relief, but couldn't solve the underlying problem. Holding on to hope for the future became a sleep technique in itself, comforted by the thought that spring and warm days would eventually come. People used that hope to help themselves fall asleep. The winter sleep struggles endured in medieval Castles are a painful reminder of just how valuable modern bedroom comfort really is. Sleepless nights that tested the limits of human endurance, animal warmth, an unspoken partnership to get through the night. You press yourself against your dog's furry belly, feeling a bit of relief from its body heat. From the stable below, you can hear the horses, and beside your bed, the purring of a curled-up cat reaches your ears. In the Middle Ages, the relationship between people and animals wasn't just one of working partnership. It was also a mutual struggle for warmth and survival. Animal body heat became, quite literally, a life-saving resource. And this valuable partnership found its deepest meaning on winter nights. Dogs in castle life served not just as guardians, but as life-saving heat sources. These loyal animals slept beside people on cold nights, sharing their body warmth and offering natural protection against frostbite. The tradition of sleeping alongside a dog was so common that nearly every family kept at least one dog in their bedroom. Castle dogs came in various sizes. Larger dogs, producing more heat, were especially prized, but smaller dogs had their advantages too, taking up less space and being more comfortable for children to sleep beside. Choosing a dog wasn't just about temperament and skill, but also about heat output. Building a close relationship with horses was another common practice. Stable hands would sleep near the horses on cold nights, benefiting from the warmth of these large animals. As a result, stables became popular sleeping spots in winter, with servants sometimes competing over the best spots. Companionship with cats was especially common among women and children. A cat's high body temperature and its ability to sleep comfortably made it an ideal bed companion. A cat curled up on your chest could provide hours of warmth and comfort. Poultry were used for warmth as well. Chickens and geese were sometimes brought indoors, especially on the coldest nights, sharing living space with people. While the hygiene implications of this practice were less than ideal, survival took priority, so it was generally tolerated. Goats and sheep provided warmth too. These animals offered double the benefit, providing both milk and heat. Sick children in particular were often fed goats' milk while benefiting from the animal's warmth at the same time. The location of animal shelters was chosen strategically to maximize heat sharing. Stables and pens were built as close as possible to living quarters, allowing quick access when needed. Living arrangements between people and animals required careful rules. Which animals slept where and with whom was determined through careful planning to avoid conflict. Animal hierarchy could even influence human hierarchy. During illness, animal warmth became especially critical. Fever patients needed cooling, while those suffering from hypothermia benefited from close contact with a warm animal. Dogs and cats effectively served as natural thermostats. For children, animal companionship was especially important. Their small bodies lost heat quickly, so children needed animal warmth more than most. Parents often had their children sleep alongside animals as a form of protection. The elderly also benefited greatly from animal warmth. As the aging body loses its capacity to generate heat, it depends more on outside heat sources. Elderly people with loyal dogs tended to live longer. For pregnant women, animal warmth was especially valuable. The increased need for warmth during pregnancy was often met with the help of animal companions. And this closeness typically continued after birth as well, with babies and young animals sometimes growing up together. Sick animals drew warmth from people too. This mutually beneficial relationship supported the health of both animal and human alike, creating shared paths to recovery. Warming a sick dog in your lap also meant benefiting from its warmth in return. Providing food for animals required shared effort. Since animal feed was scarce in winter, people often had to share their own food, which only deepened the bond between them. A hungry animal was a cold animal, and a cold animal couldn't provide warmth. Hygiene problems were real but secondary. Parasites, odors, and animal filth were unpleasant. But since survival came first, these issues were tolerated. Weekly cleaning routines were the price of maintaining this animal companionship. Security was another important function. Animals served double duty as both heat source and security system. A guard dog, sleeping through the night, provided both warmth and protection at once. Emotional bonds were strong as well. People and animals who shared the struggle for survival developed deep, emotional connections that could last a lifetime. Bonds that also provided moral support through difficult winter nights. Losing an animal companion was a source of real grief. Someone who lost a loyal animal friend suffered both emotional and physical loss, facing difficult days until they found another. Food sharing followed strict rules. Sharing meals with an animal required careful planning to make sure neither party went hungry. This sharing was really a form of investment. Since a well-fed animal produced more warmth, seasonal changes affected these animal relationships. 2. Bonds that grew distant in summer became much closer in winter, then eased back into balance again once spring arrived. The search for animal warmth in medieval castles represents one of humanity's most sincere and functional relationships with the natural world. A mutually beneficial bond that brought with it not just survival, but genuine affection and loyalty. Good night.